Welcome everybody to this final session of the year of the Graduate and Faculty Christian Forum at UBC. We appreciate your participation. It's fantastic to have people from different parts connecting via Zoom. The series started about 30 years plus with Sir John Polkinghorne from Cambridge University, and we've been inspired by his work down through the decades. And we're really happy to have a speaker from Oxford today, Art Louis, who Craig Mitten will introduce in a minute. We just want to say a word of thanks to the Murren Fund, which also helps us run these forums year to year, and all the other participants in the committee. So without further ado, I'd like to turn it over to Craig Mitten to introduce Art Louis.
Great, thanks, Gordon. Good afternoon, everyone. I am really pleased to introduce Dr. Art Louis, who is a professor of theoretical physics at the University of Oxford. So just going past 8 p.m. Your time, Art, thank you for joining us in the evening. And seeing as we're across Canada here, we've got folks in different time zones. But Professor Lewis leads an interdisciplinary research group looking at problems on the border between chemistry, physics, and biology. Writes and speaks widely on science and faith. We are very much looking forward to your talk on science and scientism. So over to you.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you for the invitation. So here we go. So this works. Feel free to interrupt me anytime. I think I'm quite happy to chat if you find anything interesting, if there are cries of heresy, all those kinds of things are quite fun. Just hide the people there. Good. So I gave myself the topic of science and scientism because I've been thinking about this for quite a long time, and it's a big topic, obviously, and a complex topic. And I just wanted to just to be clear, give you my abstract. So, science is perhaps the most successful endeavor that human beings have ever engaged in. It's tempting to think that it would also answer the big questions of life, such as why are we here and whether there is a purpose to life. And I think that these kinds of hopes give impetus to modern versions of secularism as well, in a kind of vague way. At the same time, a fully fleshed out scientism, the idea that only science brings us reliable knowledge about the world, remains unpopular in the academy, in part because it hollows out these existential questions. So I think it's becoming more popular than it used to be. And I'll argue that it's not hard to see that neither science nor any conceivable non-science can answer such existential questions. I think it's kind of a non-controversial thing. And so what I'm kind of interested in discussing more at the end, and it's not the interesting part for me is going to be really at the end, I'd be curious about your own thoughts, is I think it's really these implicit versions of scientism that remain surprisingly influential in the academic world. So even though the hard version of scientism may be growing, maybe not, these implicit versions I think have been very powerful. The question is what we do about them. So I'll start with a little more whimsical story. So this is a picture of flats in the Netherlands. When I was 7, I moved to a flat with my parents. And I remember looking up one day and having this existential crisis, because I suddenly realized that behind every single one of those flats was another family who had a whole rich and complex life. And it overwhelmed me to think that as all the things that seem to be happening in my life, something similar must be happening behind every single one of those windows. And just the thought of that many people having that many complicated experiences made me overwhelmed. And you may wonder why it took that long for me to realize this, but that's just how it was. And of course, as I went to school, I learned that, we are just part of a small, planet, which is part of a solar system, which is much, much larger. Part of a Milky Way galaxy, which is even extraordinarily larger. We're actually over here in the edge of the Milky Way galaxy. This galaxy is extraordinarily big. There's this is actually a picture of galaxies. So the Milky Way galaxy has on the order of 100 billion stars. There's on the order of 100 billion, or perhaps one order of magnitude larger number of galaxies. So there's on the order of 10 to 22, 23,000 stars. And that's extraordinary. I think that for scientists of any stripe, that is just something which amazes us and brings us a sense of awe and wonder. And that sense of awe and wonder is, of course, not new. It's been around for many, many generations. And a very famous example, of course, is from the psalmist who wrote in Psalm 8, when I look at the stars, what is man that you are mindful of him? And the idea that looking up at something grandiose in science makes us feel small is I think, a deeply felt and very commonly shared experience. And of course, for scientists, it's not just looking at the big that amazes us, it's also looking at the extremely small, the intricacy of what we see, which is also extraordinary. This question of things being very big can go one step up. And you can ask the question, not only like why are there so many stars, but the more interesting question perhaps is why is there something rather than nothing? Which I think not too long afterwards I started thinking about as well and found it rather overwhelming thoughts. And of course, there's many ways of answering this question. It's one of the great kind of philosophical questions. But the first order, really, the question isn't even why is there a universe at all, but why are there the laws of nature that allow a universe to exist? That's really the big question. So why do we have these incredibly fertile laws of nature? Why do we have laws of nature at all? Why is something rather than nothing? And by nothing, I don't mean some kind of quantum vacuum, but I mean real ontological nothingness. No laws of nature, no laws of logic, no laws of mathematics, simply nothingness. And there's three options, right? So these laws of nature have always existed and have always been instantiated in some kind of background. And that's interesting, but it's a philosophical take. It's not a scientific argument, because we don't really have any science about things that have always existed, the things that have no cause, as it were. It could be that in a different way, the laws of nature popped into being out of ontological nothingness was also kind of uncaused question. So there was real nothingness, and then the laws of nature popped into being out of them. Or, the whole space-time could be dependent on some non-spatial temporal reality, a being who cannot not exist. And that would be, in traditional theism, that would be what we could call God. And, it's a long history of thinking about these things. Aquinas very famously get the unmoved mover. And so the point is not so much that I'm going to argue for which of these 3 points I'm in favor, although given that this is a Christian gathering, I think it's pretty obvious which of the three I think is correct, and I think is more interesting, etc. But the point is all three of these are effectively philosophical arguments. None of them are ones that are in any kind of clear way amenable to science. Although science can help us sharpen these questions, they are fundamentally philosophical questions. And when I talk about science, I always talk to a broader audience. I always want to talk a little bit about science. I have a kind of little rule that I want to explain some science to you. So for those of you not scientists, I'm going to explain something very cool about physics, something that also, when I first learned about it, struck me with awe. So this is one of my great scientific heroes, Paul Dirac, a British physicist at Cambridge, who was thinking in the 1920s about the following question. So in 1926, Erwin Schrodinger published the Schrodinger Equation, which is a theory of very small things. It's kind of quantum mechanics. And already in 1905, Albert Einstein had published special relativity. So the energy, basically it says that E is mc squared is the thing that you might remember. This is E is mc squared when something moves, P is a momentum. So if you're not moving, then E is the square root of mc squared, which is mc squared, right? So it's pretty simple. So that's an energy momentum relationship. And Dirac was asking himself questions like, well, I have an energy equation from Schrodinger for very small things. I have an energy equation from Einstein, which holds for very fast things moving. It's hard to really notice that when you're moving close to the speed of light. What happens when a very small thing moves at this incredibly high speed? And so I wrote down, did it for the electron, which happens to be spin up, spin down. So it's got two components to it. And he wrote down an equation. And the only way he could make his equation with Schrodinger-like and transform according to the laws of special relativity was to add an extra component. So this, instead of having two components for the electron, he had four. And being somebody who had a great belief in mathematics, he wrote down the equation in 1928 and said that that's it. This is the equation that satisfies both Einstein's or the Lorentz transformations for special relativity and the rules of quantum mechanics. And in fact, a bit later, he speculated that extra object might be another particle. It was in fact discovered in 1932 by Carl Anderson, and it's the positron, which is a piece of antimatter. Antimatter is an amazing kind of crazy thing. So every particle that we know of has an antimatter counterpart. If a particle and its antiparticle come together, they annihilate, and the M becomes energy. So the E is mc squared is connected in there. All the M turns into E. So an enormous amount of energy is released. This is why you have PET scans, positron emission tomography, where you shoot positrons at somebody, and when they hit your flesh, basically they light up and you can see them. So antimatter is a really kind of strange thing. If I was made of antimatter or was to shake someone else's hand, I'd literally blow up, and we annihilated. We would literally blow up our entire solar system. That's the power that this would have. So it's a very strange kind of thing. And what's extraordinary is that Dirac predicted the existence of antimatter based on something completely different, which is very fast things and very small things, and trying to make them consistent with one another. And so physicists will often talk about what the Eugene Wigner, another Nobel Prize winner, coined the unreasonable effectiveness of mathematics, which is a gift we neither understand nor deserve. And it's also something extremely beautiful. So you take these very kind of rather esoteric ideas, you put them together, and you get this amazing equation called the Dirac equation. One of the fun things about being a scientist is, or fun or not fun, depends on when you're at a party, right? So if somebody comes to a party and asks you what you do, you say, I'm a theoretical physicist. People kind of go, and they try to, you see them looking around thinking, who else can they speak to? Because most people are worried about physics. This is probably not so funny in this audience of academics, but if you're in a popular room, I often tell people I worry about physics so that you don't have to. But it's good, well, it's good. I travel a lot, and when I do, I often like to work. So sometimes there's someone next to you who wants to do a lot of speaking, and so at some point I tell them I'm a physicist, and that doesn't shut them up. I tell them I like equations. If that doesn't shut them up, I tell them that Dirac equation is my favorite equation. If that doesn't shut them up, perhaps I should speak to them, because there may be somebody interested to talk to on a trip. But it's kind of a funny thing about equations. I love equations, and this is extraordinarily beautiful. And I'd say this equation that you see right here is as beautiful as the most amazing mountain range, the most unbelievable painting, or the most moving piece of music. It's absolutely extraordinarily beautiful. And it was used by Dirac to make an exceptional prediction. I remember also as a student, when I first took a course in advanced quantum mechanics and learned about this equation, I thought, well, this can't possibly be true, right? So how on earth could these two very disparate ideas make such an extraordinary prediction about the nature of reality? And I actually spent the whole night trying to figure out some way around the Dirac's arguments. That's the typical hubris of youth, right? You think you can do this. And of course, by the morning, I realized that I wasn't going to get anywhere. But it's extraordinary. It's a completely amazing thing. And every time I think about it, look at it, I feel a sense of awe and wonder, not distinct, not at all different from the kind I would feel when I look through an amazing, powerful telescope. And this idea that science and beauty are linked together is an old one. Here's another very famous mathematician, mathematical physicist, Henri Poincaré. He says, a scientist does not study nature because it's useful. He studies it because he delights in it. And he delights in it because it is beautiful. If nature were not beautiful, it would not be worth knowing. And if nature were not worth knowing, life would not be worth living. He's a Frenchman, as you can see. Dirac himself, very famous, was asked once what his fundamental belief was. And he said the laws of nature should be expressed in beautiful equations. Actually, John Polkinghorne, who was mentioned earlier in the introduction, was a student of Dirac's and has some really good Dirac stories. Yeah, I currently now work on something very different from Dirac. I work on evolutionary systems. I just published a paper last month about symmetry, and it got an enormous amount of press. So here's a picture from the New York Times, but the Le Monde, maybe 50 news articles picked up on it. It's a rather complicated paper. It's trying to talk about some interesting ideas about developmental bias and evolution. But the reason it got picked up was because we have pretty pictures. And so it's interesting how the sense of beauty, the sense of nature still kind of resonates with people. And of course, there's a long history of people worrying that science was somehow going to mess this beauty up. Very famous Keats's poem, cold philosophy will conquer all mysteries by rule and line, empty the haunted air and gnomed mine, unweave a rainbow as it erewhile made. Actually, there's a very lovely book by Richard Dawkins called Unweaving the Rainbow. It's as always, beautifully written, has its ups and its downs in the book, but it's well worth it. And he says, the feeling of awed wonder that science can give us is one of the highest experience of which the human psyche is capable. So this sense of beauty is definitely there in science, and it's something really extraordinary. There's a paper just came out in Nature, a little commentary last week in Nature on the work of Brendan Vaidyanathan, I can't pronounce his name, who did a big survey on scientists in around the world. In fact, what happens, Elaine Howard Eklund and Brendan were looking at questions related to religious views of scientists, and noticed in their interviews that scientists, religious or not religious, kept coming back to aesthetic arguments and arguments about beauty. So they decided to go back to their data and generate some new data and ask more about beauty. And it turns out that scientists are hugely impacted by beauty, hugely influenced by beauty, hugely motivated by beauty. And in fact, the amount that you're motivated by aesthetic considerations is sometimes positively correlated with how good you are as a scientist or how successful you are as a scientist. So this is definitely a very big part of the scientific endeavor. And so I pinch myself sometimes that I get paid to think about these kinds of things. I get paid money, which is quite extraordinary, to think about things that I find interesting, like those protein complexes that I showed you in the other page. You know, in a generation or two ago, I would have to have been born in wealth in order to be able to devote myself to this kind of thinking. And so it's a real privilege to be able to think about beautiful things and make a living off of it, even if it's not always a great one. So that's just a little thing to say, that to point out that I think science is amazing. I think science is probably the greatest thing that human beings have ever engaged in. It's probably the greatest, I think it's definitely the greatest thing that we've ever been able to do. And so I want to make that point at the beginning before I start worrying about something like scientism. So what is scientism? Well, I think it's actually a catch-all term for a wide range of different ideas. But I'm going to give a little interview picture here with Alex Rosenberg. So I made a television series called Why Are We Here? That's shown in different places. I think it's still available, probably is available in Canada or has been shown in Canada. I'm not sure if you've seen it. And one of the people that we really enjoyed interviewing was the philosopher Alex Rosenberg. I wasn't able to embed this video into my PowerPoint for some reason, so I'm going to stop my share for a second and then come back to you with the video online, and then I'll come back to my PowerPoint. So let me share my screen again. There we go, Alex Rosenberg. So we interviewed him at his home, and here you will see.
Alex, can you tell us what you mean by scientism?
Right. So scientism, as the word is normally used, is a term of abuse. And what it means is the unreasonable and unwarranted crediting of science with powers to explain that it is by many people not so credited. And the exaggerated respect for science's methods and science's findings. Now, take that definition and remove the word exaggerated, and you've got my definition of scientism. Scientism is the view that science is our best guide to the nature of reality, its methods, and its findings are our best account of the nature of reality. I've taken the word scientism and tried to turn it into a non-pejorative expression in the way that we're familiar with from the way the LGBT community and others have taken words like queer and made them into badges of honor instead of terms of abuse.
Do you think that the scientism, the way you view it, is that a common view in the university?
I think it's not a common view in the university, and even among those who embrace it, there's a certain amount of trepidation about going public, because when you do so, you tend to step on the feet of those who think there are many ways of knowing, and that science already has such imperialist pretensions as to threaten other disciplines. And for that reason, those who embrace it, even in the comfort and privacy of their own minds, are reluctant to be publicly associated with it.
You're not afraid to be?
No.
No. Why is that?
Well, I was a physics student as an undergraduate, and I made a conceptual mistake which drew me into philosophy. And by the time I'd figured out the mistake, it was too late to go back into physics. But the kinds of questions that have held my attention throughout my entire academic life are these questions that are raised by the sciences, and which I think the sciences can ultimately answer, and are now, especially as a result of what's happened in the last 30 or 40 years, in a position to take away from philosophy and give answers to them.
So you think it was you said you made a mistake moving into philosophy?
A conceptual mistake that led me away from physics and into philosophy.
So what was that mistake?
Just gonna skip for a second.
Deeper ones, or at least acknowledge the existence that provides, and science provides explanations for a broad range of questions that many people might look to philosophy or to religion for answers to. As science pushes back its frontiers, of course, the bigger the frontier, the more unknowns there are. But in some respect, we begin to be able to answer questions that had long been held as the privileged domain of philosophy.
So what are some of these questions that you think people say, we must look to other things for, which now you think science can?
Oh, well, consider the list after, does God exist? Questions about, does the universe have a meaning? What's the purpose of life? What's the nature of right and wrong? How does the brain relate to the mind? Do we have free will? What does moral responsibility consist in? That's a whole list of questions that constitutes the lion's share of philosophy. And I think all of them have answers that are given by science. So is there a God? Of course not. What is the meaning of the universe? It doesn't have any. What is the purpose of life? Ditto. Is there a difference between right and wrong, good and bad? There's not a moral difference between them. What is the nature of the relationship between the mind and the brain? They're identical. The mind is the brain. Is there free will? Not a chance. Does the lessons of the past have any particular bearing that would help us cope with the future? Less and less, if it ever had any at all. So that's a nice list.
Yes, so that's Alex Rosenberg, who I have a very high respect for. He's a very distinguished philosopher at Duke, and also as you can see, a very enthusiastic exponent of scientism. And so in our film, Why Are We Here, we talked with him quite at length. And it's always nice to have people who are clear. Right? So I think what I liked about Alex Rosenberg is that he's very clear about what his premises are, which is that there's nothing but atoms, molecules, and therefore also what the conclusions that follow from this are, which are pretty much nihilistic conclusions. And as he points out, scientism is a kind of word of abuse in certain circles. It's not something that's held by many serious philosophers or serious scientists. Partially, I think, because it in a kind of reductio ad absurdum way, it erodes a lot of things that we hold dear. Now, in spite of that, I think that there are many people who hold premises that are somewhat like scientism, but are not that well thought through. So Alex has thought these things through incredibly carefully, and I think that's what makes him such an interesting thinker. But there are many, many, many people who have not. And probably where you see this kind of, I'll call this some unclear kind of scientism, is particularly endemic in science popularization. So here's a Dutch philosopher, Jeroen de Ridder at the Free University, who has a very nice article where he says, if one is to believe recent popular scientific accounts of developments in physics, biology, neuroscience, and cognitive science, most of the perennial philosophical questions have been wrested from the hands of philosophers by now, only to be resolved or sometimes dissolved by contemporary science. And probably in contrast to Alex Rosenberg, if you look a bit more carefully, these kind of scientism here is often not that well defined. So here's a very kind of interesting case. Lawrence Krauss, who I think is Canadian actually, a cosmologist who wrote a book called The Universe from Nothing. And on the back, it had a pretty strong endorsement of Richard Dawkins. Even the last remaining trump card of the theologian, why is there something rather than nothing, shrivels up before your eyes as you read these pages. And basically what Krauss is arguing here is the following, which is, if you have a quantum vacuum, then you can have things pop out of that quantum vacuum, because quantum vacuums are quite structured, and therefore something like universe might pop out of this. That's very roughly what he's saying. In fact, I told you about the Dirac equation, And what Dirac basically shows that you can electrons and positrons come in these pairs, and you can show that electrons and positrons will pop into being out of the vacuum, and then they'll annihilate again and pop into being from the energy turns into mass and vice versa. And effectively, to first order, Krauss is arguing that something similar might be true for universes. So he says, I've explained this pesky question that theologians talk about. But of course, it doesn't answer that question at all, and it's rather trivial to see why, because in order to have this work, you need to have a quantum system, you need to have the laws of nature and a very particular kind of laws of nature. And the question isn't, why is there a universe from the laws of nature? The question is, are there laws of nature in the first place? So he also has a kind of weak view of philosophy. He says philosophy is a field that unfortunately reminds you of that old Woody Allen joke, those who can't do teach, those who can't teach Jim. And that was a response to a really eviscerating review in the New York Times by David Albert, who basically says Krauss is dead wrong. And Albert is also an atheist, but he takes him to task for saying, more or less, for having not properly understood what the question is that he thinks he's answering. And Krauss then goes on and calls Albert a moron, and then this is the bit of the quote that he does. Well, Albert is one of the world's most famous philosophers of physics, definitely not a moron, if not moronic. And so what's interesting about this story, when I first read it and I read the book and all the publicity around it, and it had all kinds of, it was featured in all kinds of bookshops, etc., was, Albert's argument is pretty straightforward. Any kind of undergraduate in philosophy could point that out. Surely the editors of this series would have picked that up. Surely the journalists writing rather glowing reviews of it would have picked it up. So why is it that they kind of just bought this thing hook, line, and sinker, which is a rather silly idea, which, certainly thoughtful opponents of scientism like Rosenberg wouldn't say has explained the ontological problem. It's kind of interesting. Why does this happen? Right? Why does this kind of not well thought through scientism come this way? Here's another person I just recommended one of his books, Unweaving the Rainbow. Of course, a very famous popularizer of science and a very good popularizer of science, but also very famous for expounding on a kind of scientism. Lots of bits of his writing that basically argue that science is the only way of obtaining truth. Now, that's, of course, really a question of epistemology. So when philosophers look at scientism, it's often classed as an epistemic point of view. The idea is that the only way of obtaining reliable knowledge about the world is the methods of science. Usually it means something like the natural sciences, but it can be a broader set depending on how they want to define it. Dawkins often means something like the natural sciences. And this is a debate he did with Rowan Williams, who was then Archbishop of Canterbury. This is moderated by Sir Anthony Kenny, who's a philosopher. And Sir Anthony basically asked him some questions about, aren't you really talking about epistemology? And I just put this little clip out from the video where Dawkins says, well, I don't know the words epistemic, and so I'm not going to use that. And it was quite shocking, if you are fundamentally making an argument about epistemology, an argument that says in order to understand something about the nature of reality, you need to use the methods of science, then certainly you should at least understand that what you're doing is epistemology. You should at least know what the word means. Right? And so it's interesting. You see Krauss basically saying rather silly things and then calling philosophers who disagree with him moronic. And you see here Dawkins kind of almost willingly not engaging with thinkers, even thinkers who are atheists on this topic. And that's rather surprising. Here's Stephen Hawking, another great popularizer of science, also a great scientist. He says in his book, The Grand Design, how can we understand the world in which we find ourselves? Did the universe need a creator? Why is there something rather than nothing? Why do we exist? Traditionally, these questions are for philosophy, but philosophy is dead. Scientists have become the bearers of the torch of discovery in a quest for knowledge. And if you read the book, it has some interesting little bits of science popularization in there, but it doesn't answer these questions even remotely. And so again, these are smart people who not only they have a team of smart editors around them, and you ask yourself, how could you get these such silly kind of things put in there? It's kind of an interesting question. Of course, perhaps the most famous science popularizer of all, Carl Sagan at Cornell, at the beginning of his series, called Cosmos, he always said the cosmos is all there ever is and all there ever will be. If you read a bit more into his kind of writings, he was an exponent of some version of scientism. I have a theory about this, which I think is a lay theory, which is that essentially, as some of you will know, in the scientific community, scientific popularizers are often looked down on as people that didn't left the true hard work of science and to kind of talk to the public. That's not quite as true now as it was, but definitely would be true in the time of Sagan, for example. Sagan famously was turned down by the National Academy. He had some real slights that he received from the scientific public. And I think so. You need to have a real drive in order to move into popularization. And I think if you somehow believe that science gives answers to everything, then that's something that you might do, even if you are yourself an inconsistent thinker. And so if you look at people like Sagan or people like Dawkins who have a lot of work they've written down, you'll see, I call it some kind of scientism, because they talk a lot about scientism. They make scientific types of comments. They often disparage philosophical things, but they have a very well-defined, well, they have not a well-defined, but a series of statements that are quite deeply moral, things that they feel very strongly about that definitely don't agree with Alex Rosenberg's nihilistic version of scientism. So they have a kind of scientism. I call it some kind of scientism because it's in essence inconsistent. And the interesting question is really, why is that so common, so popular? Here's another one of my colleagues, Peter Adkins, who we also interview in the series. A very charming man, but he says things that I think are rather strange, like there is no reason to expect that science cannot deal with any aspect of existence. Though poets may aspire to understanding, their talents are more akin to entertaining self-deception. Philosophers too, I'm afraid, have contributed to the understanding of the universe little more than poets. I long for immortality, but I know that my only hope of achieving it is through science and medicine, not through sentiment and its subsets, art and theology. And so what I think is happening here is something like this. It's clear that science has been this extraordinary, successful endeavor. For example, the computer power that's in my telephone is much larger than the computer power that was used to bring the first Apollo space mission people to the moon. And that's extraordinary technological advances. Medical advances have developed immensely. We're able to live longer and live healthier, and we know a lot more about medicine, although there's still a lot more to be done. So it's clear that science is very powerful, and it would be fantastic if science and these methods that have been so successful could also be used to answer, the big questions of life, moral questions like what is right and wrong, or existential questions like, how should I live? Or questions like, should, my experience of awe and wonder in science be a good thing, which is what Richard Dawkins believes that it is, although as far as I can tell, Alex Rosenberg thinks that's a category mistake. So those are the kinds of questions that one could ask. And it's tempting to feel that since science has had so much progress over so many years, that this kind of scientism is going to, that somehow we should align ourselves with this. So I think that what's happening with these popularizers is a kind of interesting, something makes you a good popularizer as well. Something makes you a good politician is often an ability to skate over the fine details of something and to see the big picture and to present the big picture. Or, something isn't quite clear, to make it sound clear. That is rhetorically much stronger than saying it could be this way, it could be that way. And properly explaining science to the public is tremendously difficult. We've seen this with the current COVID response by scientists. They've had a hard time trying to explain uncertainty to the public because it's a hard thing to explain. And it's much easier if you explain something with certainty. And so I think that there's something about that thing that makes you good science popularizer, that makes you also susceptible to a kind of naive version of scientism where you don't realize that you are making inconsistent steps. And that's where Rosenberg is good, because he points out that a lot of these kinds of claims are not don't follow from the premises of scientism. And in fact, the idea that scientism, that no advance of science is going to be able to answer this question is an old one. Here's a very nice, another Oxford professor, Sir Peter Medawar, a Nobel Prize winner, and also an atheist, who had a really lovely book called The Limits of Science just before he died, and said that there is indeed a limit upon science is made very likely by the existence of questions that science cannot answer, and that no conceivable advance of science would empower it to answer. These are the questions that children ask, the ultimate questions of Karl Popper. I have in mind such questions as, how did everything begin? What are we all here for? What is the point of living? So kind of existential questions. It is not the science, therefore, but the metaphysics, imaginative literature, or religion that we must turn for answers to questions having to do with first and last things. When science is a great and glorious enterprise, the most successful, I argue, that humans have ever engaged in. You'll see that in that little quote in my abstract. To reproach it for its inability to answer all the questions we should like to put to it is no more sensible than to reproach a railway locomotive for not flying, or in general not performing any other operation for which it was not designed. And so what he basically points out in this book is science really can't answer those kinds of questions. And rather than getting into kind of a deep philosophical discussion about this, what I'm going to give you is a few examples that I use for a general audience. So apologies if this is a bit over simplistic, but I don't think I need to get very deep to show why this won't work, why this is kind of obviously true, and actually I think uncontroversially true. If you do want to look more into this, there's a really nice project at the Free University called Science Beyond Scientism in 2013-2016. It's kind of still going on. Jeroen de Ridder, Rick Peels, and René van Woudenberg did this. There's a very nice book that they wrote, Science Prospects and Problems. It's an edited volume that gives you, Alex Rosenberg is in there. So you give a wide range of different views on this. It's a good way of getting into the kind of meaty thoughts about scientism itself. They're mainly looking at strong scientism there, so not really as much about the popularization, although they did write that very nice paper on popularization. There's a very nice book. I think Ian Hutchinson was in Vancouver recently, called Monopolizing Knowledge. It's a more popular book that he wrote about a decade ago that looks a bit at scientism and how it functions in our public domain. And it's a big and super interesting thing. I'm just going to trying to give you a few very kind of quick elevator type discussions why it's clear that science can't answer big questions. So let's say I ask a question like, how do I measure or evaluate the value of human life or the value of human beings more generally? It's obviously a very important question. It lies at the basis of our legal systems and our political systems and our social systems. And so I would say, well, how would I use science to adjudicate that kind of question? Well, I could, if I'm a chemist, I'd measure the value of the elements in your body. That's kind of ridiculous because somebody with gold fillings is not worth more than someone without gold fillings. You can measure the size of your brain, if I was a physiologist, or how smart you are, a psychologist, or how the community values you, if I was an anthropologist, or if I was an economist, how much economic value you produce. And sometimes I worry that that's how our political overlords look at us. But we instinctively feel that there's something wrong about each of these measures. And in fact, I would go further and say that if you try to measure the value of humans, or the intrinsic value of humans particularly, by any of these techniques, it's actually not only wrong, but actually dangerous, because you immediately start bringing in gradations between people. And we in our say common political life, we agree on some kind of fundamental human rights that people have, and the idea of that is grounded in what? Well, it's hard to ground it actually. And certainly scientism does not ground it. My grandparents were humanists in the Netherlands, which is a group that's very keen on not believing in God, but also very keen on a kind of premise that humans have this intrinsic value. And when I would I still speak to humanists and ask them, where does that come from? They just say, well, it's a brute fact about the world. And I said, well, why is that brute fact there? Well, it's not so clear. It's just there. I think it's good that they hold to that brute fact. But you worry about these kinds of things that are not grounded in anything else. Obviously, religious people, Christians, for example, would say that the intrinsic value of human beings lies in the fact that they are created and loved by God. And that's a very important grounding of intrinsic human rights. Although, obviously, religious communities haven't always acted consistently with their beliefs on this topic. So this is a very interesting question, super interesting question, super important question. Science is not the way of answering it. Science can maybe inform and sharpen your questions, but it's not going to answer it, and no conceivable advance of science would answer it. As a story that really spoke to me, or I often use, is from Bill Newsom, who's a neuroscientist at Stanford, who told me he was once walking across the Stanford campus and with a colleague who looked at the memorial chapel that you see a picture of there, and his colleague said, we should I think we should blow this thing up because it's a monument to irrationality. To which Bill quipped, well, then we should blow up my home. It's also a monument to irrationality. And his colleague took a bit of a double take. And the point that Bill made then is that, you know, when I decided to get married, for example, I didn't use the techniques of, I didn't use repeatable experiments or these kinds of techniques to decide whether I should get married or not get married. Obviously, you go around, there are irrational ways of getting, of choosing a marriage partner, like meeting somebody and the first on the street and grabbing them and saying, please marry me. It's actually rather frightening. But there are more rational ways that communities have worked out. You would ask yourself things like, how does community value that person? What do they think about us together? What do wise people, what kind of advice do they give us? What do our friends think about it? You can do compatibility tests that are obviously based in psychological knowledge that are quite useful. But at the end of the day, where do you squeeze your toothpaste, that kind of thing. But at the end of the day, you don't get married to somebody because you both score 95% on compatibility tests. There's something more to it. And the fundamental point that Bill points out here is that you don't have access to knowledge of what it's like to be married to somebody until after you're married. And so there is, and many important decisions in life have that nature to them, that you don't actually have access to the data, as it were, until you make in some sense a leap of faith. And so many, not only that, you can, if you wait for kind of scientific certainty, you'll wait forever. And then you'll never make a step forward. So you have to make kind of steps of faith, as it were. And so most important questions have that kind of nature to them. Doesn't mean that science can't inform them, but that means that fundamentally the scientific method is not the right way of thinking about these kinds of decisions. And so, when we think about these big questions, science, God, the human condition, etc., then you can think about science, to first order, its great success comes from self-imposed limits, from posing limits on making things that you could do something like reproducible experiments, perhaps, or it's more complicated, obviously, in historical sciences, but something analogous can play a role there. As you can think of science as a great bright light, and it shines extremely brightly. But the question is all the things that you care about that are important, are they only there under the lights? And the great American philosopher Alvin Plantinga uses this analogy when he says, the argument that only science can bring true knowledge is like a drunk who insists on looking for his lost car keys only under the street light, on the grounds that the light was better there. In fact, it would go the drunk one better. It would insist that because the keys would be hard to find in the dark, they must be under the lights. This is Plantinga's kind of criticism of hardcore scientism, but also of certain versions of soft scientism, the kinds you see in, or I would say, not well-defined scientism that you see in popularization. People basically say, since science is a great, powerful light, we should only use science or scientific method or something like that to answer these important questions. And there's a few more examples. I'll skip one or two of them. The other one, I think, which is quite common, is what I call something which has been called nothing buttery. And this is a classic example of this. So this is Francis Crick, another great exponent of scientism. You, your joys and your sorrows, your memories and your ambitions, your sense of personality and free will are in fact no more than nothing but the behavior of a vast assembly of nerve cells and their associated molecules. Now, of course, it's true that our brains are extremely important and our minds are embedded in them. And so the behavior, our behavior is very closely linked to this assembly of nerve cells. But to say that we are nothing but that is a kind of classic scientific, I think kind of naive scientific move. And I'll skip, I've had an example of that, but I think I'll skip that for now. And so these kinds of big questions that we often worry about in our current world, why are we here? How should we live? Are super important. And obviously for those of us who are Christians or religious in other ways, we use our faith to answer these kinds of questions. And obviously we have long discussions in our communities about good ways of answering these questions and bad ways of answering the questions. And we believe that there are good and bad ways of answering them, even within the confines of our religious faith. But in the kind of public sphere, these types of engagements have been largely put to the side. And instead, what's left over is a kind of inability to engage in these big questions in any kind of deep way. And I think what happens is effectively the soft versions of scientism make people think that somehow science has answered those questions or will answer those questions, and so they don't really think about it further. So I told you about my grandparents. I remember my grandfather, I came to visit me once when I was still in Cambridge, and I asked him at that time. It was not that easy to speak to them about matters of faith. They didn't like to, but he had him on his own visiting me, so I thought I could push him a little bit. So I asked him, why, grandfather, why are you so adamant that there is no God, and why are you so strong in your atheism and your humanism? And he said, well, when I was a young man, I was 19. So maybe I skipped an important part of background. So my grandfather had to leave school when he was 16 to help support his family. Worked his whole life in a factory and climbed up to management level, and but really had the kind of, I would say, the personality and the interests of an academic, and would have loved to have been an academic, but was born in a generation when that was just much harder to do than it would be now. And so he always had enormous respect for the academy. Was extremely proud that I went to university and went on into academia, and was something he really wanted for his life, and so he valued it very much. And so when I asked that question, I was always surprised, why was he so dismissive of kind of religious ideas? Why did he not even seem to want to investigate them? Because it wasn't consistent with the other things that he loved to investigate. And so he said to me, but when I was 19, I was part of a nature club, and we had a mathematician from the University of Leiden come in, who explained to us that the Bible was an unreliable document. And so I've not really, bothered thinking about it since. And I remember being quite disappointed by the quality of that answer, but also it made me think, for my grandfather, who greatly admired the scientific community. And in the Netherlands, we say Wetenschap, like Wissenschaft in German. It's a broader sense. The academic community really valued them. And so he just took this as face value, must be true. And then never really thought about it much more after that. And actually, lived his life as a good man, according to a set of morals that he believed were probably true, but those were not really well grounded in any kind of way. And what I realized is that somehow this, it's a kind of scientism had gotten him, and it also kind of closed him off from thinking about these things. It even made him kind of nervous about thinking about religious things, because in his mind, these had to be somehow irrational, because they weren't science. And that's the kind of soft scientism that I think plays a role in our academic world a lot more than we think. And so people are very nervous when you try to bring religious approaches into all kinds of questions, because they're nervous that somehow it doesn't feel right, something's wrong about it. It can even get worse than that. So Steven Pinker, the great popularizer, who also strays into some rather naive versions of scientism, a number of years ago got taken to task a little bit with Ross Dohat, who's a New York Times columnist and quite amusing to read. And he was basically, it's an article on the scientism. I've got a link right here, the scientism of Steven Pinker. And he points something out that's quite interesting. He said, this is an impressively swift march from allowing grudgingly that scientific discovery do not dictate values to asserting that they mitigate, very strong in favor of Steven Pinker's very own moral worldview. So I think what happens as well with this kind of soft scientism, which is not, not well thought through like the strong scientism of Alex Rosenberg, but is something more vague, is that it turns these people into kind of high priests. And what they do is they wrap themselves in the mantle of science. That's what Steven Pinker does. Then flashes you with some amazing brilliance about some scientific fact that you didn't know about and what it means. And then makes a little slave hand, and therefore says, and this therefore, even if it doesn't quite prove that my moral values are correct, it definitely mitigates in their favor. And therefore, it becomes a power play. And so I think fundamentally, a lot of the way the soft scientism works, is as a kind of assertion of power. You say, I have science on my side, therefore believe me. And of course, it's interesting that it's not surprising that the moral and ethical and big picture view that this creates, or that this supports, is the view that the proponent of scientism happens to believe in for whatever reason. And so I think that this is the kind of scientism I wanted to get to in the end. And I've seen it a lot. I'm still trying to get, I'm not a social scientist. It's been written about, I'm not naive about what's been written about. There's, if you read Charles Taylor or a bunch of people from that kind of wing, this has been written about in all kinds of complicated ways. But I think it's interesting to see for us who are scientists how this works. So we've become a kind of high priests. In my own university, I think this is true for universities across the country, across the world, the success of science slowly but surely we grow at the expense of other disciplines which do not seem to be as hard or as capable of producing real results. They don't always help themselves as well with the kinds of things they focus on. And so there's a kind of unwritten sense that somehow the really big advances of knowledge are going to have to come from the sciences, and that's where we should put our money in, and that's where we should expand, and that's what is going to be truly important in this world. I don't think that's correct or true, and I think it functions not at all in a conscious, well-defined way, a la Rosenberg. I think it functions in this kind of softer way, a la what you see in the science popularizers or in this little example of Steven Pinker. And so the real interesting question then is, what should we do about this kind of thing? And with that, I thought I'd finish my talk and open up to questions.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Ard, for a fascinating talk and in-depth exploration of these issues. I was wondering if there are people who would like to ask some questions. Just feel free to unmute yourself, and or if you would like, put something in the chat and we can reiterate that over, but encourage verbal questions. If you'd like to jump in, please go ahead. Who wants to go first?
Hello, can I ask a
go ahead,
question?
Gustavo, yeah.
Art, it's a general question. Do you think that science will evolve to the point where its methodologies will be able to incorporate this kind of questions? Or do you think it's
which kind of questions?
Why we're here, all these big questions? Or you think there's a hard wall where science will never be able to tackle this kind of questions?
Well, so it depends on what you mean by tackle. Right? So obviously science can help us sharpen these questions. But the first order, this goes back to Hume. You don't derive an is from an ought story from an is, right? So it's really hard to take science and derive from it, say, moral arguments about what's right and what's wrong. You can say a lot about how our psychology works, or how our sociology works, or our anthropology works, or how our biological heritage affects our way of feeling or moral kind of feelings, but you can't say what's right and what's wrong. Those are simply not scientific questions, and it's not about science advancing. It's just those are questions in a different category.
Okay.
So a good example would be like if I take a rock and I throw it at you, right? Well, you can use the physiology to see how my muscles move, right? You could use psychology to see how I visually perceive you, or maybe what kind of states I have in my mind that maybe throw them at you. You use physics to measure the velocity of the rock as it comes towards you, and perhaps the effect of its impact on you, etc. None of that tells you whether I should have thrown a rock at you or not, whether it's justified. I might think it's justified. We might have arguments about it. But at the end of the day, those are arguments that come from other places.
Great, thank you.
Question. Others? Yeah, Ron, go ahead.
Yeah, I appreciate your talk. Thank you. You've talked about science popularizers, but I've also noticed that COVID, climate change has exposed this perhaps. There seems to be an anti-science pushback that we also see. And I'm wondering if anything that you've talked about can speak to that as well.
Well, I mean, so anti-science is a very complicated phenomenon, has many aspects to it, but surely one aspect of it is a kind of pushback against what people consider to be an overconfidence of scientism. It's hard to know. So it's very complicated because it gets wrapped up in anti-elitist arguments as well, right? So it gets wrapped up into arguments about, and these are sometimes fundamental economic disparities that get felt, and so these things all play a role. I mean, I'm not as familiar with what's happening in Canada. I know the UK situation, the Dutch situation a little better, and so I would say the anti-science feelings there have a lot to do with a sense of the government's trying to control us, the government, they're not being honest, The scientists are making all kinds of claims which turned out not to be true. If you look more carefully, the problem that scientists often had is that, you know, it was a very interesting situation because you have to make policy in real time. You can't wait on uncertainty. And of course, you know, for the politicians, it's fine. They do this all the time. For the scientists, it's hard, right? And so these things got conflated in people's minds. And I think that was definitely genuinely hard. It was also interesting. You did see, you know, a lot of disagreement among scientists that was then publicly aired. Just normal. It's normal science. We disagree about stuff all the time. It was played out in public forum rather than in the kind of professional forums, and that eroded trust in science. Whether scientism itself, you know, how much of a role that played is hard to know. I think, you know, in North America, where you have very strong culture wars, we have them imported from North America, in Europe as well. Not quite to the same extent, but they're definitely here and growing. So those, I think, some of what you see there, which is the basically Pinkerian kind of move, where I have a set of values, maybe particularly liberal values, that my friends around me also all have in these academic and other elite cities, the same thing that my journalist friends have and my television friends have. We all have these views. And since we're on the right side of history, we must be right about these moral views as well. And therefore, we can impose them on others. That is part of what's driving culture wars. And so because science is then linked to a sociological crowd of people who happen to also have certain kind of moral and ethical views that others that you may not share, these things get bundled together. So it becomes a bundling effect. So we see them interesting in the UK. So we've got the Tories and the Labour Party. Labour traditionally was the party of the working class, the Tories of the upper class traditionally. And at the last election, that got switched dramatically. And the question was then, why did that got switched? And the reason it got switched is because the perception on the ground among working class people was that the Labour Party had turned into a party of liberal metropolitan elite, is what they called it. And they wanted to snub their nose at it. And so they voted for, you know, Boris Johnson, who's probably as elite as it gets, but at least doesn't pretend not to be. That was a bit of the view. And so the anti-science thing gets linked in. So if you're feeling, and we had Brexit in the UK, these are also big motivators for this were anti-establishment views, feelings of being left out. And so when, you know, and this is probably true, you know, in my university, nobody that I knew voted for Brexit. I'm a European, definitely didn't like it, but I don't know anybody that at least admitted to voting for Brexit. But in the working class neighborhoods of Oxford, that's definitely was dominant the Brexit. So these things have become class-based, right? We, the scientists, are on the one side, the other people on the other side. And so these things get bundled together on the back of culture wars in extremely complicated ways. I do think scientism itself plays a role, because I think what scientism, as I said, has done is it has emboldened, let's say, the metropolitan elite in some of their views, as these views are correct, because we're on the side of science and therefore also right about our moral views in the kind of high priest sense that you saw with Pinker. And that's a difficult thing to work around, because these groups, you know, we've separated more than we used to. There's more echo chambers. People have less people around them who are different from them, and all these things end up becoming, they kind of these become feedback loops that are sometimes hard to get out of. I mean, I remember years ago I was in Northern Ireland, and which is obviously a place where religion plays a very big role and is very, very strongly felt by people. And Richard Dawkins was interviewed on television, and he said, you know, sending a child to a religious, like a Christian school or a Catholic school, is tantamount to child abuse. And I remember thinking to myself, well, the problem is that for the average person on the streets of Belfast, who's either Catholic or Protestant, and sends their child to the school that they grew up in and they feel part of their community, they're going to say, well, then so much the worse for science. So I think scientism does have that effect, and it's had it for a while. But I think it's gotten compounded in recent years.
Thank you.
Great, thanks.
So I think, just to summarize, that's a bit of a long and not very concise digression, but I think the Pinker example I gave you, I think, does play a role in reinforcing people's views that they're right about other issues, and that hardens everything.
Great. Other comments, questions, thoughts? Yeah, Olaf, go ahead.
Well, thank you so much for your presentation. I learned a lot. And I think you found a way of cutting through some of this difficulty. But you make a statement which I would really appreciate you saying some more about, that scientism remains unpopular in the academy. Now, my experience of the academy may be different than yours, and I wonder if you have some empirical data that would confirm this. Is it just the eliteness of the Oxford University environment, or do you find it equally a statement that is valid across other countries as well as other institutions?
Yeah, so that's a super good question. So the best study of this is a large-scale studies by Lena Howard Eklund, who's a sociologist at Rice, who's done some large, I think 8-nation studies of scientists' religious beliefs. And basically what you find is that scientists are not as religious as the communities that they're in, but it correlates pretty well. And that the kind of Dawkinsian types of atheists really make up a relatively small fraction of the scientific communities. That's probably the best empirical work on it. I should be careful in maybe qualifying that statement. The other example I gave is Alex Rosenberg, who's a full-on proponent of strong scientism, who basically says it's a term of abuse, and he's trying to reinstate it in the academy. And he's written books on this topic, etc. The issue the point I was trying to make, which maybe wasn't as clear as it could have been, was that it's the hard scientism that's maybe not that popular. Right? The nihilist who says there is nothing but atoms, molecules, therefore, all moral questions are meaningless. History will teach us nothing. The kinds of things that Rosenberg says, and I think Rosenberg is correct in saying that his premises, which is nothing but atoms, molecules, very strongly support the kind of conclusions that he makes. I think what happens in practice in our academy, which is very pervasive and we all experience, is this soft scientism, which basically people have moral views which they've picked up from somewhere else, but they also believe that you shouldn't be able to be allowed to talk about, for example, religious ways of thinking about this because somehow they're not scientific and therefore bad. But in spite of that, they've got other, they still have philosophical views that are no better or are not particularly well justified, and people are just inconsistent scientists. And I think that is a very, very common view in the academy, and that's what I'm trying to find a good way of articulating that and saying there's a distinction between what I call soft scientism. I gotta find a better word for it, which is this kind of inconsistent scientism. And I think the way it kind of functions is, science is this great thing that's brought us all these advances. Who wouldn't like to be on the side of science? You hear from the popularizers and others that somehow that if you're a scientist, you shouldn't really believe in these religious things. And so you kind of think this is where you're going to go. But effectively, what you do, if you're not very careful, is you take a Pinkerian type of move, and your faith in science ends up making you more confident in your moral views or your ethical views, etc., or your political views. And I think that's the kind of way that soft scientism works. And it obviously gives an anti-religious bias to things that's not well thought through. I mean, there's many other reasons why people are nervous about religion in the public sphere, but I think this is one of the reasons.
Thank you. What's the spelling of the name of Eklund?
Yeah, ECKLUND.
Thank you.
Yeah, and it's at Rice University, and she's a sociologist. And she's written extensively on this topic, and by far the best and biggest studies.
Great. Darren, go ahead.
Hi, Ard. My name is Darren. I used to be at UBC, so that's kind of how I got here. But I'm a chemistry prof at a Christian liberal arts university.
Okay.
So yeah, we make our students take philosophy courses and sciences. So it's part of our liberal arts approach. But I'm wondering about your comments today about soft scientism. The word that popped into my mind was unexamined scientism.
Yeah. Maybe that's a better word. Thank you.
And my question is, like the work that you're doing,
yeah.
With your why are we here and other talks that you're given, how open are you finding people to examine some of their philosophical commitments? Like, I think part of the problem is people are trained so specifically in the sciences. You're not going to take a philosophy course. You don't have the tools to think about these categories, and you you end up in an unexamined place. And when you start talking with people, in your experience, I'm sure you've talked to many, many people of all sorts of commitments. How open are people to examining?
Well, I think this is not that open in general, right? So
Okay.
that's because one of the problems, of course, is that if you, this is a great thing about, say, a Christian liberal arts education, that you can get this wider set of education. At least you have the vocabulary to talk about these things. But a lot of people don't have the vocabulary to talk about these things. So, for example, sometimes when I'm giving a talk to a broader audience, I might give arguments about ethics or morality and say, where's morality come from? And people find it very hard to distinguish between, kind of meta-ethical questions, like where do our moral ideas come from in the first place, to the question of what is right and what is wrong, two different things, right? And they conflate them all together, and they think that I'm telling them that if they don't believe in God, they're not good people, that kind of stuff. And so one of the problems is that the vocabulary is not there, right? And I think my point maybe is that tendency to live this unexamined life is reinforced by this soft scientism, by the idea that science is somehow supporting my set of views, because scientists that I know and have told me this is how I should think about the world. Yeah. And it's hard to, maybe the other thing that also supports this is the conflict thesis. So it's the historical idea that science and faith have been at loggerheads with each other. There's kind of classic narratives, and kind of progress narratives, enlightenment narratives that are also playing a similar kind of role. But I didn't really talk about them today. They all play a role in that. This kind of panoply of things that bring it together.
Well, I just wanted to say thanks for your work. I actually have been teaching a history and philosophy of science course, and we used some of your Why Are We Here interviews yesterday. So,
okay, I'm glad you used it.
So then a couple of my students were intrigued, and they've come. So and it's really helpful, and yeah, just thank you for your work.
Yeah, well, thank you. Well, it was an extremely fun thing to do, because we basically traveled around interviewing lots of very interesting people. Alex Rosenberg is somebody I fundamentally disagree with, but we had a really fun time, and he thanked us afterwards after we showed him Why Are We Here, and he liked it. He said, that's great. He really thought it was great. Yeah. So I was happy with that, even though I think
his interview is a great, like, my students watch that and they're all like, and they're like, what? Wow, that man has, I think yesterday a student made a comment like, well, at least he's consistent. And that's the point today too. So
so David, who made the film, is a filmmaker, is a friend of mine, an atheist. So one of the themes of the film is they have a scientist who believes in God, and the artist who doesn't believe in God is kind of flipping the classic stereotypes. But David doesn't believe in God, but does believe in various moral values and in ultimate, moral realism, for example, and other kinds of views. And so one of the interesting things that kind of, and he's the one that put everything together. And so I think it's really in a testament to his own kind of honesty in thinking about these things, which is that, one of the things that you see through the film is that he keeps being told that he's inconsistent, in his thinking, because he wants to have the good things, but doesn't, but they don't follow from his premises. And so Alex and I agree, which is that if you make the premises Alex does, atheistic premises, you end up nihilism, and Dave thinks that's wrong. Dave's actually writing a book now where he's trying to argue for why you could have these things based on atheism. I think it'll be very interesting to see what he comes up with, because he's an interesting thinker. But I think it's inconsistent, doesn't make any sense.
Yeah, thanks.
Great, thanks, Darren. Gord, go ahead.
Yeah, along that line, I find it interesting that Sam Harris, in his Moral Landscape, has tried to put a scientific floor underneath ethics or underneath morality. And I noticed that J.D. Hunter and his colleague at University of Virginia have responded to that. But I wondered what you think of Sam Harris's attempt to make science a foundation or a grounding for ethics.
Well, so this is this Moral Landscape book that he wrote. I'm trying to remember the exact quote, if I can find it. I actually was just reading something about it yesterday. So in Jeroen de Ridder's article, he goes extensively into Harris. So effectively, I'll summarize it for you. So what Harris basically does, so if you haven't read, The Moral Landscape is a book by Sam Harris where he basically says we can make a science out of morality. And the way this works is that we have some measure of human well-being, some kind of human flourishing or something. And then we put people into brain scans and we measure what brings them the most well-being. And then this will teach us what's good and what's bad. So it's really a kind of, it's a utilitarian approach. So utilitarianism is the idea that you derive your ethical views from because consequentialism is what it is, by the consequences of what it does. In other words, the way you judge the morality of something is by its effects long term. And this is perfectly fine view to have, but he doesn't actually say that he's taken this particular philosophical view. And if you have it, then he said, if you're a consequentialist, then you can use, what he should have said is, if you're a consequentialist really hardcore, then here's ways you could use science to help do your consequentialism. And even consequentialists don't necessarily agree with him on that point. But the reason why he's not read in philosophy curricula and hasn't overturned centuries of moral philosophies, because consequentialism is one of many views of where morality comes from, and there are obvious problems with consequentialism. The classic examples are, right, we know there are people who desperately need organ transplants. And so if I take one of you and harvest all your organs, I could save many people, right? So I will hugely increase the general happiness or well-being of 10 people by killing you. And so they would die otherwise. And so consequentialists would say that's good. Right? We all recoil at this idea. And so that's just why consequentialism has never been the dominant, never has been as popular as consequentialists would like it to be. And if you don't, so I think in the end of the day, Harris, surprisingly, because he was an undergraduate and philosophy background as an undergraduate, Harris calls his question, I think he calls them boring. But he does the same exact thing as Pinker does. Is he basically wraps up the mental science, takes a very particular philosophical stance, pretends like he's not doing that. Okay, I don't think he actually knows better, and then gives a lot of waving of science, of wraps of mental science, and then proclaims this is how we should live. And that's not only wrong, it's morally wrong. And I think of that group, it's interesting. This is something interesting to see, is what some of these popularizers will do. And it's interesting to see someone like Harris, right? I think it's just wrong. And again, you wonder, like Krauss, right, or like some of Dawkins' books, like what were their editors thinking? What were the reviewers thinking who often positively reviewed it without pointing out, an incredible deep flaw at it's not so much a flaw. It's not like he didn't understand what he was doing. It's actually a conscious attempt to deceive. And in spite of that, these books, people are so popular. And that's because I think they're playing with this kind of soft scientism in the background, because they've wrapped themselves in mental science. Somehow it's good. And I think it's not only, in the case of Harris, I think it's not only wrong, but it's dangerous. You're feeding people really bad ideas by somebody who actually knows better.
Thanks. Thanks, Gord. Thanks, Ard. Anyone else want to jump in? I know we're pressing 9:15 UK time, so I don't want to keep you too much later, Ard. Maybe we will, thank you. Really appreciate it. Let's, why don't we call it there? Gord, any closing comments from you?
Well, just a comment from your friend Arnold Siekema from TWU. He says hello and sorry he couldn't stay for the question period, but he appreciated your talk.
Well, thanks. Yeah, thank you. Say thank you to Arnold.
Yeah, and thanks very much for this very, very stimulating talk. It was really interesting, and you covered a massive landscape. I think it gives us lots to think about and lots to dialogue about.
Super.
All the best in your work. I appreciate it very much, and may you live long and prosper
Thank you very much.
in this.
Thank you very much for your time, and have a good day.